Hey guys, we are finally wrapping up our coverage of Survivor Australia versus the World with a player ranking. So in this video, I'll be ranking all the players in the game based on how I feel like they played across the season, which was definitely an interesting list. I feel like there were definitely some interesting debates to be had with certain placements, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we have 14 people to talk about, and spend some more time. Let's go into the video. So starting off at number 14, the player I believe played the worst on the season was definitely a debate. I kind of went back and forth over this bottom spot. However, at number 14, I did decide to go with George here, who is technically the third boot on the season, and he did at least survive a round of gameplay, which is obviously an advantage that he has over other people. And you can also say that he had a massive target on his back and probably didn't have much of a shot in the season to begin with, considering how big of a reputation he had by that point. But at the same time, the reason he's at the very bottom here is that despite his massive target, he still didn't play that well at the end of the day. And I feel like he definitely did things that made the situation worse, where he obviously was on the bottom right from the start, where we saw him trying to build this alliance with David and Luke, only for them to turn him down. And he really was this massive target coming to this first round, and largely gets saved due to Kirby and Sarah wanting to break up David, who they saw as a bigger long-term threat with him having more connections. But even then, George wanted to target Janine during the round as a safe foe. He ends up voting for Janine at that tribal, which definitely could have bit him in the butt considering it was a tie vote. Even beyond that, you also have him throwing Kirby under the bus by telling David that Kirby was the one throwing out his name. That also could have backfired. And I feel like had David not been such a blatant threat with him being set up well on the Australia tribe, there's definitely a shot that Kirby could have backed down from wanting to save him and just vote him out based off that. And we see that the following round, where after David is out, the group that voted to keep him just immediately turns on him. And he also plays that round poorly, with him trying to be domineering with Janine and Luke, telling them that they had to vote for each other. And you also have him rubbing a lot of people the wrong way. That also pushed more people away from him. So I do feel like George on the whole played the season pretty poorly. And despite him having a pretty massive target on his back, and despite him surviving one tribal, I feel like he played poorly enough across his short run here to where I feel like he kind of fits being in the very bottom, even though he is technically the third boot of the season, which is why he's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we're moving on now to the proper first boot of the season, and here we have Rob Bentley. And I feel like Rob also didn't play this the best, where while he has a decent idea in wanting to bring the international players together to target the US players, I feel like he does it in an overly domineering way that really annoys the likes of Lisa and Cass to the point where they don't really want to work with him, and really allows like Cirie and Parvati to bring them to their side instead. And he ends up being voted out unanimously here, which is obviously not a great look as well, to where at least George was voted out in a close vote of both of his tribals. So I feel like there's definitely an argument for Rob being towards the bottom here. The reason he's one spot higher is that I feel like George made more mistakes in terms of him wanting to target Janine and Luke during each of his tribals, to where at least Rob had the right idea in wanting to bring the internationals together. And while I can fault him for his approach to dealing with the internationals that pushed them away, I feel like the fact that he at least had the right idea and also still had some disadvantages, like the fact that he was a former winner, the fact that his tribe was majority women, to where the women end up working together moving forward. I feel like those things were enough excuses to where I felt like Rob should be at least above George, though at the end of the day, I feel like his game was still not particularly great, to where he's here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we're moving on now to the second boot of the season, and here we have David. And David is someone who should have been in a pretty good spot coming into the season, where even though he is a pretty big target with him being a former winner, I feel like this was a decent enough landing spot for him, where he had plenty of allies from his previous seasons, people like Luke, Janine, Sarah, and I feel like had he been able to hold that group together, he would have had the initial majority on the Australia tribe. The problem is that the people outside of that alliance knew that they weren't really in that, where you have Kirby knowing that she wasn't really in that, and through that she tries to flip the game against David and is successfully able to flip Sarah from his side, which is obviously a shortcoming on his end. And I think beyond that, the fact that he doesn't really work with George, where George had come to David and Luke wanting to align with them, only for David and Luke to kind of brush him aside and to actively target George, which is obviously another shortcoming on David's end. Or while I could see where he was coming from, where he thought that he already had the numbers and didn't really need George as an additional number, I still think that is technically an issue on his end. But I do feel like compared to Rob and George, I feel like David probably made fewer mistakes and was definitely better situated on his tribe than Rob and George ever were, to where he did have a very solid backing. He ends up being taken out very narrowly in a tie vote, to where it was a 4-3 vote, effectively speaking. And beyond that, he also had connections to Parvati from the other tribe due to them being on Deal or No Deal Island, to where had he made a merge, he would have had another number there. So I feel like I have fewer complaints with David's game than with either George or Rob. And while I think his connections made him a bigger target beyond the fact that he was a former winner, I do feel like at the end of the day, I feel like David was definitely in a better spot than Rob and George ever were, which is why he's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we're actually jumping a little bit in the boot order here to the merge boot, and here we have Cirie. And I was a bit disappointed by Cirie across the season, to where had I made a preseason power ranking coming into the season, I probably would have had her relatively high, as she fits in a lot with these more questionable casting choices on these all-star seasons that tend to do pretty well simply due to them having a smaller reputation, and I felt like Cirie definitely had some advantages based off that. However, instead, she ends up being the merge boot here, and I do feel like her game on the whole is pretty messy, where early on she was actually in a pretty decent spot where she was in the David power structure. Mind you, she was towards the bottom of that, but she still had that connection there, and was seen as a swing vote by Kirby, to where Kirby did obviously tried to flip her, and she does eventually flip to take out David, which I do think is a pretty questionable move for Cirie, as I feel like she also wasn't very well positioned on the Kirby side of things, where Kirby and Shaunie had a relationship, and while George was this easy target, I feel like she was not the best situated on that side of things, and we even see her regretting her decision afterwards, to where she felt like she would have stuck with the David side, like had she had more hindsight there. And I feel like by her trying to play the middle afterwards, she really kind of just burns bridges, but from the Kirby side as well, to where Kirby doesn't really trust her moving forward. And I think beyond that, we do see Cirie, again, trying to play the game where she does try to target Shaunie during the George round, but doesn't really get her way there and doesn't really have much agency within that. And after the George round, she's in a pretty rough spot, to where while she does, again, try to play the game against Shaunie, I feel like had they gone back to Tribal before the merge, she would have been in a pretty tricky spot there. And I could definitely see a world where she could have been a target there. And we even see it through the merge where Kirby just kind of outplays her by going to Cirie and Parvati and ends up working with them. And they do end up flipping the game against Cirie, where Kirby and Shaunie do flip against the Australians, take out Cirie there. So I do feel like on the whole, it's not a particularly great game, where I feel like Cirie was in a pretty rough spot from the George vote onwards and didn't really get her way at many opportunities, where I feel like she did things that benefited Kirby more so than herself, and at the same time didn't really build any favors with the other side, to where I feel like she was not very well situated by the time she went out. So at the end of the day, I feel like Cirie's game is pretty rocky, and while she does make it to the merge, I feel like she was in a pretty rough spot by the end of the pre-merge and probably could have gone out had they gone to that last round before the merge. So it's for that reason I can't really have her any higher than number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have the final pre-merge boot on the board, and here we have Tony Velachos. And I feel like Tony played about as well as I could have expected him to, considering that, again, he was a pretty massive target coming to the season, being a 2-time winner, and also the tribe not being the most set up for him, where it was a tribe that was majority international, majority female, and you even have Cirie and Parvati being this very tight duo that kind of left Tony kind of on his own here. And in general, the fact that Tony even survived a single tribal is somewhat impressive, where I do have to give him credit for at least surviving the first tribal, able to not even be a target during that first round, which is pretty good there. And at the same time, I feel like he didn't really make many mistakes here, where he was definitely trying to lay low and trying to at least curry enough favor with the majority to where he would at least make it to a merge. And he did almost make it to the merge, which is somewhat impressive there, and kind of gets unlucky by the format of the final round, to where both tribes end up going to tribal, and essentially his fate in the game came down to Cirie's fire making ability, which wasn't very good by that point in the season. So I do feel like Tony was obviously pretty unlucky by the round he was taken out in. And I feel like he definitely would have been in a better spot had he made it to the merge, where I feel like at that point he would have had a bit more options and definitely would have been able to play a more dynamic game had he made it towards the merge. But obviously he gets sniped out a bit early there. Though at the same time, there was a push to try to save him, where Parvati did at least want to keep him over Tommy at that last round, and kind of had her hand forced by the internationals plus Cirie there. So again, there was still some outs for him with the actual round he goes out in, and I feel like he just didn't do that much wrong across the season, to where it was at least enough to have him above Cirie for me, to where he's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we are once again sticking with the World Tribe here, but number 9 we do have Tommy, and in a lot of ways I do feel bad for Tommy, where it did feel like he was an outsider in the season with him being from a lesser known franchise, that being Survivor Finland. And on top of that, like, he was pretty much on the bottom for a lot of his run as well, where he didn't really have that much agency at the end of the day. Though at the same time, I feel like his game here is still not the greatest in the world, where again, he is like not in the great spot on the original World Tribe, where he's left out the initial majority group. And he ends up voting out Rob here at the first tribal, which I do feel like for Tommy at least was a mistake. I feel like Rob would have been better for Tommy's game in the long term. And I feel like by voting out Rob, he is essentially towards the bottom of the group moving forward, where it's essentially either him or Tony had they ever gone back to tribal there. And while he ends up being spared over Tony at the tribal that they go to, I feel like had they gone to a tribal earlier on before the merge, there's definitely a shot that Parvati could have gotten her way and pushing out Tommy there. Though obviously he's able to at least hold ground with the other international players. And then coming into the merge, like, he is, again, technically part of the majority, where it did seem like the World Tribe had the advantage there. And they do end up splitting their votes on Cirie and Janine during that first tribal that they go to. After that, he is able to be part of the Kirby plan, the following tribal. That's around the final 8 that his game really crumbles, where at that point, the Australians and Cirie and Parvati do end up turning on the international players. And a lot of it seems to stem from the internationals not really building much of a relationship with the Australians, to where that really put Tommy in a pretty bad spot there. And while he is able to avoid the first tribal, where Cass goes out due to him winning immunity, he's obviously eventually taken out at the second tribal that happens immediately afterwards. And while it's unfortunate that he didn't really get a chance to talk with anyone and try to turn things around due to the nature of that tribal, I still think he probably would have been targeted anyway, considering that Tommy was a pretty big target due to him having won the last few immunities, and with Cirie and Parvati already having done a lot more groundwork to building a relationship with the Australians. I do feel like Tommy was in a pretty bad spot even if it was a normal round. So at the end of the day, I feel like Tommy's game is not particularly great, and while he was technically part of the majority during the early merge, even then he didn't have that much influence, where he didn't really have much to do with the Cirie or Kirby plans. Even during the Cass round, he supposedly wanted to make a move on Parvati, only for Cass and Lisa to talk him out of it and to go for Shaunie instead. So even among his own group, he didn't really have that much influence, and I feel like his game on the whole is not overly impressive. So I feel like for those reasons, I can't really have him any higher than number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we are once again sticking with the World Tribe here, but number 8 we do have Lisa, and I feel like Lisa is another game that I didn't feel like she had that much agency across a lot of it, even though I feel like it was still somewhat impressive. She made another deep run despite her being a former winner. Though with that said, I feel like she definitely was in a better spot for a lot of it compared to Tommy, where early on she seemed to be in a pretty good spot on the original World Tribe, where she obviously had the connection to the other international players, but obviously was able to build a pretty strong connection to Cirie. And while a lot of it seemed to be due to her like really being a big fan of Cirie and her just being starstruck, I still feel like she was able to play that pretty well, was able to be part of the majority early on, taking out Rob, and then afterwards was pretty safe afterwards, where she's able to get her way in targeting Tony and isn't really mentioned as a target during a lot of the pre-merge there. And then after the merge, she's again able to be part of the majority during the Cirie and Kirby rounds, though even then she was a decoy target during the Kirby round, but again, wasn't really that much danger there. Though similar to Tommy and Cass, her game does crumble after that, where the internationals do become a pretty big target at the final 8. And I feel like Lisa plays around pretty sloppily, where you have her like talking to Janine and Luke about wanting to target Parvati, but not wanting to vote for Parvati herself, which came off as pretty sus both to Janine and Luke, but also to Parvati, as Parvati really wondered why she was talking to Janine and Luke to begin with. And that entire tribal afterwards was not great for her either, where she ends up losing Cass first, and then afterwards she does offer to quit the game to save Tommy, only for her to be talked out of that by JLP, and ends up losing Tommy yet again. And by that point, she was pretty much a dead woman walking, to where unless she won out from that point, she was pretty clearly the next to go, and she is taken out at that following tribal at the final 6. So I do feel like Lisa's game for the most part is kind of similar to Tommy's, where I feel like she was probably in a better position for more of it compared to Tommy. Though at the same time, I also think she would have struggled to win a jury vote as well, where I do think part of the reason why she offered to quit the game to say Tommy was due to her recognizing that she probably wasn't going to win at that point. So while I think there were definitely some pros to Lisa's game in the sense that she was able to remain relatively safe and was also the last to be targeted at the internationals, I feel like there are enough holes within her game to where I can't really have her any higher than number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we're actually jumping forward a bit in the boot order here to someone who made it somewhat deep into the season. However, I feel like their actual game here is a bit underwhelming. But number 7, we do have Shaunie, and Shaunie obviously gets all the way to 5th place. And again, the fact that she came in as one of the bigger names on the board, yet still made it pretty deep into the season, is at least somewhat impressive in my eyes. However, I feel like she kind of gives up towards the end of the game and didn't really have much to do by the time she eventually goes out here. Where early on, she is decently positioned on the original World Tribe. She obviously has the connection to Kirby, but also with the other Australians, to where she did seem pretty safe there on the original Australia tribe. However, she does decide to flip to take out David there, which is obviously a good move for Shaunie, as it didn't really seem like she was the best situated within that power structure as well compared to Kirby. However, I do feel like she follows it up with a pretty questionable move by taking out George here, where again, George did seemingly want to work with her coming into the season, and I do feel like George would have been a good asset for Shaunie to have, at least during the pre-merge. But yet I feel like she seemed pretty fine letting him go right at the bat. And while I think George played it poorly himself to where she didn't really have much of a choice anyway, I don't really like the fact that she did want to take out George when it did seem like George was a better number for her than the others. Not to mention the fact that Sarah did want to target her during that round as well, to where she did try to get Kirby to turn on Shaunie. And while it was unsuccessful, I do feel like that was not a great sign for Shaunie moving forward. And I think had they gone back to Tribal before the merge, I think she probably would have been in a tough spot there where, while I think Sarah probably gets voted out instead, I still think there were some danger spots for Shaunie, like the fact that Sarah was targeting her. And with Luke having his idol that he could have played, I could definitely see a world where Sarah comes to Luke and Janine and tries to flip the vote there, though obviously it doesn't come to pass. And then from the merge on, I do feel like she kind of drops the ball afterwards, where while she does flip with Kirby initially to take out Sarah, she's immediately blindsided the following round, where she ends up losing Kirby, her closest ally. And from that point on, she's kind of just there in the game, where I feel like she doesn't really do that much to advance what she wants. And at the point where Luke and Janine end up latching on to Cirie and Parvati, I feel like she kind of doesn't really have a path towards the end of the game, where her only real option at that point is to work with the other international players to try to counter that alliance. But even then, the international players wanted to target her during the cast round, where the plan initially was for Cass, Tommy, and Elisa to target Shaunie, but she ends up voting out Cass. And then she just goes along with voting out Tommy and Lisa back to back and really comes into the final five as a pretty clear target at that point, where at the point where she fails to win immunity, she does get taken out there. So I do feel like at the end of the day, I feel like Shaunie's game from the post-merge on is pretty lackluster, where while she did play somewhat aggressively in the pre-merge and the merge round itself, I feel like from the point where she loses Kirby, she doesn't really have much of a path forward in the game. And I also think she would have struggled to win a jury vote at the end, considering how she had played across the season. So I feel like for those reasons, I can't really have her too much higher than this spot, even though she did make it all the way to the final five. But it's for that reason that I have her here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have the highest ranked international player left on the board, and here we have Cass. And I did consider having Cass a little bit higher, as it did seem like she had the most agency out of her, Lisa, and Tommy, and I do feel like she probably had the most win equity out of the three had she gotten towards the end of the game, and probably had the most agency out of the three, even though she was still taking out the earliest. Where I still think she was in a pretty good spot early on, where she's part of the majority of the group, she's able to take out Rob, she's able to find an idol not too long afterwards. And I do have to give her a lot of credit for pushing the target on the Tony over Tommy at that last level to go to before the merge, where I feel like she did a lot of pushing there, was able to get Cirie on board. I find that somewhat impressive. And she is able to remain in the majority for those first few votes after the merge. However, she also becomes a pretty big target almost immediately after the merge, where we do see the Australians wanting to target her at that first round, and it does become a 4-3-3 vote, which is obviously pretty hairy there. She's also a pretty big target at the following round, where the Australians once again want to target her, only for her to win immunity. That's also not particularly great. Though at the same time, I do give her a good amount of credit for getting the target under Kirby, where she was able to really get a lot of the internationals and Parvati on board to targeting Kirby in that spot. So I do have to give her some credit for that. Though obviously she does eventually get taken out at the final 8, where at that point, Cirie and Parvati do turn on the internationals, and she is also tricked by Parvati into playing her idol onto Lisa there, which is obviously not a great look, as she is eventually taken out herself. And in general, I feel like Cass would have had a pretty tough road to getting towards the end of the game, where considering that she was a pretty big target right from the merge on, I feel like she probably would have needed to win out if she one to have any shot of actually getting towards the end. However, I also think she had a decent amount of win equity to where had she gotten to the end with Lisa and Tommy, she clearly wins that final 3, even against like Janine or Shaunie even. I do think she also has a very good shot there. So I do feel like Cass definitely had a lot of respect by a lot of the cast. So mixing that with the fact that she had the most agency out of the internationals, where I do have to give her a lot of credit for getting the votes on the Tony during the Tony round and also on the Kirby during the Kirby round. I feel like those things were enough to have her the highest ranked of the internationals, even though she was still only booted in 8th place, to where she's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have the earliest boot left on the board to talk about, and here we have Kirby. And I'm actually a little surprised that Kirby ended up being this high on the list, considering that she was only booted at the final 9. And in a lot of ways, I still have a lot of issues with her as a player, in the sense that I feel like she's still a very aggressive strategic player, someone who loves blindsides and doesn't really care about how big of a target she makes herself, even though I still think she has a lot of skills for the game, where I feel like we once again see on the season how great she is at building relationships and really being able to make big moves, even if they do make her a big target, where early on, she's not really part of the initial power structure, where I feel like David and his group were clearly the initial majority on the Australia tribe. Kirby wasn't really a part of that. However, she's able to really flip the game on David, where she's able to work with Shaunie due to their outside relationship. She's able to flip Cirie to her side, despite Cirie being more loyal to David. And she's really able to take control of the Australia tribe right off the bat by flipping the game on David, taking him out in a tie vote there, and then being in a pretty good spot afterwards, where even though Cirie does regret her David vote and tries to offer Shaunie up as his like compromise target, you have Kirby continuing to move forward by taking out George in the next round and really having the one up on Cirie, to where had they gone by the tribal, I feel like Kirby would have had the advantage there to possibly take out Cirie, though obviously they don't go by the tribal. But then after the merge, I feel like she still was able to play pretty dynamically, where she was able to counter Cirie, where even though Cirie like was throwing Kirby under the bus by that point, she was able to align with Cirie and Parvati, build a better relationship with them compared to Cirie, and really blindside Cirie at the next round, where she does flip on the Australians, takes out Cirie there. Though obviously that also makes her a pretty big target coming to the following round, where she is eventually taken out. Though with that said, she also gets a bit unlucky by Cass winning immunity, to where had Cass not won immunity, I do think she would have had at least some groundwork to flip the game on the internationals one round before it does eventually happen. Though at the same time, I think Kirby would have also struggled with her threat management, where by that point she did burn the Australians by flipping on them, and with Janine and Luke eventually picking up Cirie and Parvati, I do think Kirby would have been turned on eventually at some point, but I still find Kirby's game somewhat impressive, where despite her coming into the season not being in a great spot, I do feel like she did at least pull off that great move in blindsiding David right at the bat, and still having a decent amount of influence afterwards, to where she was able to at least outplay Cirie, even though Cirie should have had the advantage in flipping over from the Kirby side after the merge. So I do feel like Kirby's game on the whole was still pretty impressive, even though she was still the earliest boot of the people we have talked about. And even though I think she would have had a tough path moving forward, I feel like compared to the people we already talked about, I feel like she has enough advantages over them with the amount of agency that she had in terms of her domination in the original Australia tribe, to where I did decide to have her the highest ranked of these people, to where she's here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we are now at the final 4, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 4, and to me, I feel like this is a pretty clear person to have a number 4, but we do have Luke, who did end up getting second on the season. That's something at least. However, I feel like if it were not for that, he probably would be even lower, if I'm being honest, considering that I feel like his game for the most part is not particularly great, where he spends about the first 2/3 of the game outside the majority group, which is obviously not a great look there. And I still think there are plenty of issues outside of that make it hard for me to have him too much higher. Now he does have a good enough starting spot on the original Australia tribe, where he has a connection to David and Janine, and should have been in the initial majority group. However, he does end up getting flipped on that first vote, where Kirby does end up outplaying them, takes out David there, which is obviously a pretty big loss for Luke there. He's also not part of the George plan that happens the following round, where even though the majority does flip against George there, he is not included into that, where he does vote for Shaunie. And then afterwards, well, he probably would have been pretty safe, as it did seem like it would have been between Cirie and Shaunie. He didn't really do much to improve his position there. And then after the merge, he's once again on the bottom, where you do have Kirby and Shaunie flipping against the Australians to take out Cirie at the first round. He's not part of that. And he's also left out of the Kirby blindside the following round, where even Janine was pulled into that, to where Luke ends up voting for Cirie in that round. That's not particularly great. Though it's around the final 8 that he does finally find his footing in the game, where he builds a pretty good relationship with Parvati, and through his his connections to Janine and Cirie, he is a part of the majority from that point on in the game, where they do end up becoming the final four. Though even then, there is still some wonkiness, like the fact that he does tell Parvati about his idol and does convince her to rip up her knowledge's power, which is a good move, though at the same time, like he also was the reason Parvati got that advantage to begin with, where he was the one to send Parvati back to camp from the auction. And he also does go on an immunity run as well that also kept him safe during that stretch. And while he probably didn't need that immunity run, as it did seem like Cirie and Parvati were pretty loyal to him, it also was something that helped him at least. You also had the final 5 round where there was this whole discussion about Luke using his idol to take out Cirie, and there was that whole awkward exchange where Luke gives up immunity and Parvati and Luke play their idols on each other. That was kind of funny. And then you had the final 4 where I do feel like he gets outplayed by Janine, where I feel like Janine did a better job at securing her spot at the end compared to Luke, to where Luke has to go into fire making. And then it gets to the end against Parvati where he just straight up loses at that point. So I do feel like Luke's game for the most part is not particularly great, where while he is part of the majority during the tail end of his run, and also was helped by winning immunities, I think there were plenty of holes in this game, like the fact that he was on the outs for so much of the early game. And even towards the end of the game, I feel like Janine outplayed him, to where Janine did a better job at securing Parvati and Cirie's loyalty at the very end, whereas Luke didn't. So I feel like those things were enough to where I couldn't really have Luke any higher than number 4 here. Now moving on to number 3, and we actually have the highest ranked Australian left on the board to talk about, and here we have Janine. And obviously Luke and Janine are seen as this duo, and there are definitely similarities to Janine's game with Luke's, in the sense that they were technically on the bottom for a lot of the pre-merge there. And obviously they do end up playing a pretty similar game by working together the entire time. However, I do think Janine ultimately played a better version of Luke's game, where even though they were in similar positions for a lot of it, I feel like Janine played better from the bottom. And I feel like she made fewer mistakes compared to Luke in terms of her navigation through the game that really allowed her to end up in that position, where again, I do feel like pre-merge is pretty similar, where she is part of David's alliance initially that crumbles at the first round, is also on the outs during the George round, where she ends up voting for Shaunie there. But I think from the George round on, we start to see Janine playing a lot more actively from the bottom compared to Luke, where we do see her talking to Kirby and telling her that Sarah has been throwing her name out, and really sowing distrust between the two and allowing those cracks to take hold. And I do think had the Australia tribe gone back to tribal before the merge, that Luke and Janine would have been pretty safe, and it probably would have been between Sarah and Shaunie at that point. So I do have to give Janine some credit there for really sowing distrust between Sarah and Kirby at that point. Though with that said, she is on the outs when Kirby does flip on Sarah after the merge, where she is not part of that Sarah blindside. However, she's able to recover from that pretty well, where afterwards she does try to target Cass at that point until Cass wins immunity, but even then is able to pivot to put the target onto Kirby. And I feel like Janine did a lot of work to ensure that the target would land on Kirby after that point, whereas Luke was just kind of there. Obviously, he wasn't part of the Kirby plan. However, from the final 8 on, I do feel like Luke and Janine are part of the majority from that point on, where they do latch onto Cirie and Parvati. I think Janine gets a lot of credit for the Cass move, where she had planted the target on Cass from the previous round, but at the point where Cass does win immunity, I do think she definitely deserves a lot of credit for getting the target on the Cass there. And from that point on, I do think they are in the majority from that point on. But at the same time, I think Janine also does a good job at securing Cirie and Parvati's loyalty, to where Cirie and Parvati would choose Janine over Luke at the final 4. That eventually plays out there. And while I could say that some of that is due to Janine being a smaller jury threat compared to Luke, I still have to give Janine credit for ensuring that Cirie and Parvati would choose her over Luke at that current point. Though with that said, she pretty much had no shot at winning the season, and while a lot of that is due to outside situations, like the fact that she's already rich and everyone knows that, she obviously didn't have the greatest final trial performance either. So again, I do feel like she struggled with winning at the end as well. However, I think compared to Luke, I think Janine was a lot more active in how she approached the game. I think Janine deserved a lot of credit for getting her and Luke into the good position that they were at the end of the game. So I feel like those things were a major reason why I give Janine the edge here over Luke. Though with that said, I feel like there's a pretty clear top 2 in my eyes, so because of that, she is here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I feel like this top 2 was pretty apparent to me, and while there was a little debate over the order, I do feel like by the end I was pretty definitive on who the number 2 spot is. But number 2, we do have Cirie Fields, the final juror of the season. And I feel like Cirie played a pretty good game on this season, where she was able to essentially recreate the Black Widow Brigade for the most part, where she was essentially in a pretty powerful position from beginning to end alongside Parvati. And I think there are actually some points in the game where Cirie gets her way over Parvati, which was definitely a consideration for her, like being closer to number one, even though I still went with Parvati at number one by the end of it. Now, early on, she's in a pretty good spot on the original World Tribe, where she is able to be part of the majority there, alongside Parvati and the other internationals, is able to take out Rob at that first tribal, and they're able to get their way at the following round, where she does push to take out Tony at the next round, is able to force Parvati's hand there, which, again, is a point for her over Parvati, where Parvati did want to keep Tony around until Cirie and the other internationals really pushed to take out Tony there. And then after the merge, like, she's once again in a pretty good spot where they take out Cirie at that first round after Kirby and Shaunie flip. Afterwards, they're immediately able to flip the game onto Kirby once again, which is actually another point where Cirie gets her way over Parvati, where Parvati wanted to keep Kirby and had the better relationship with Kirby compared to Cirie, but Cirie is able to get her way there. And then afterwards, they're able to align with Luke and Janine that essentially creates a straightforward path to the Final Four. However, I do also think this is the point where Cirie kind of lets go of the gas a little bit and kind of allows Parvati to get her way more so, where I feel like the Lisa round in particular is clearly a point where Parvati gets her way over Cirie, where Lisa was probably a better number for Cirie at that point compared to Parvati. And I think Parvati also had the better relationship with Luke and Janine as well, to where I feel like Parvati was better situated to get to the final three compared to Cirie. Where, yes, while we get to the final four and Parvati does win immunity, that essentially forces Luke and Janine to vote out Cirie over Parvati. I still think they would have done so, even if that wasn't the case, where I feel like Parvati and Luke in particular had a pretty close bond for a lot of that season as well, too, where I do feel like Cirie was probably not in the greatest spot in that particular Final Four configuration, where while she does get to the Final Four through that, I feel like she would have had a very tough road in getting to the very end. And to be fair, she does at least get to a fire making challenge against Luke, which is something. And while it was pretty apparent that she was going to lose that, at least she started a fire. That's something at least. So I do feel like Cirie ultimately came into the end game in probably a worse spot compared to Parvati. I think it's also worth mentioning that Cirie was a bigger target at many points compared to Parvati, where Cirie constantly got votes at each of the tribals that they attend during the season. She gets a vote at the Rob tribal, she gets a vote at the Tony tribal, she gets votes at the Kirby tribal, she gets votes at the Tommy tribal, she even gets votes at the Shaunie tribal at the final five. So I feel like Parvati was also better insulated with the people outside their core group that made it so that Cirie was targeted over Parvati, which is another knock against her. And I'm also not entirely sure if Cirie beats Parvati if she gets to the end either, where it felt to me that the jury saw Parvati as a bigger player as well, to where I feel like Cirie also would have struggled with winning against Parvati, which is an issue considering that Cirie wanted to go to the end with Parvati. So I feel like those things were another knock against her, and a major reason why I did decide to leave Cirie behind here at number 2, even though I still feel like she played a pretty strong game and once again, like, proved to everyone why she's one of the greatest to play the game, but still she came up short by the end of it, which is why she's here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person who played the best game on Survivor Australia versus the world is Parvati Shallow, the winner of the season, and we are now in a world where Parvati is a 2-time winner. And I feel like Parvati played a pretty strong winning game on the season, where her and Cirie essentially dominated the game from beginning to end, with Parvati facing pretty little adversity along the way, which is all pretty good there. Where early on, she's able to build the majority alliance on the World Tribe, where she aligns with all the women to take out Rob at that first tribal. And despite Rob kind of clocking her early on as his big threat, he ends up voting for Cirie at that tribal, which I think is somewhat noteworthy there, but she's able to remain in a pretty good spot afterwards, where she ends up finding an idol. We get to the Tony round, where she does technically not get her way there, where she wanted to keep Tony around as a shield, but the others like pushed her to target Tony instead, which is a slight knock to her game, but really doesn't harm her that much considering that Tony probably would have flipped moving forward anyway. So again, take that for what you will. But afterwards, I feel like Parvati does pretty well after the merge, where she's able to build a pretty good bond with Kirby to the point where Kirby ends up flipping to work with Parvati at the following round, where they end up blindsiding Sarah at that first round. But then afterwards, she is forced to cut Kirby at the next round, where the internationals plus Cirie do force her hand in taking out Kirby in that spot, which is obviously not great. However, it doesn't really harm her position afterwards, and plus, with it being Kirby, you can only see the argument for why getting rid of Kirby might be better for Parvati's game anyway. However, from the final 8 on, like, she ends up aligning with Luke and Janine, and from that point on, they are essentially able to steamroll from that point on, taking out the internationals plus Shaunie at the final 5. And I do feel like she's able to remain pretty safe during that stretch despite Luke winning immunity after immunity. And she's never really in that much danger during that stretch either, where while there was a push by Tommy to blindside her at the final 8, even the likes of Lisa and Cass convinced him not to and go for Shaunie instead, so even then she was pretty safe. And while there was some wonkiness with her like ripping up her knowledge's power after Luke told her to, I mean, considering that she had a pretty good bond with Luke, I mean, it was probably better for her to ensure Luke's loyalty, considering that Luke did seem pretty loyal to her, and she was intent on taking Luke pretty deep into the game anyway. And then you had the whole Final 5 situation where she does convince Luke to give him immunity, only for her to play her idol on him and for him to play his idol on her. And from that point on, I do feel like she had a pretty smooth ride to the end as well, especially after when she wins final immunity, where at that point she essentially has won the game, where she obviously ends up winning in the final 3 scenario she got with Janine and Luke. But even against Cirie, I'm inclined to think she wins that scenario as well, and with Cirie also wanting to take her to the end, I do feel like Parvati is pretty set up well to win the game from that point on anyway. So I feel like on the whole, I think Parvati played a pretty impressive winning game. Now, yes, there were still some points where I think she didn't really get her way, namely during the Tony and Kirby rounds. I still think she was very well positioned during a lot of the game anyway, to where I don't think those moves necessarily harmed her position. And I still think she got a 1-up on Cirie anyway by the end of the game, to where I think she had the better bond with Luke and Janine, to where it did seem like she would have been chosen over Cirie by them. Even at the final 6, her convincing Cirie to cut Lisa at that point is another demonstration of her influence in the game. So I do feel like at the end of the day, I think Parvati still demonstrated a lot of agency across a lot of the game. I think she played a pretty dominant game. And with her now being a 2-time winner, I think there's a serious argument for her being the greatest Survivor player ever. So I think there's a lot to like here with Parvati's game, and I think she's clearly the best player of the season, to where she's here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video, along with my coverage of Survivor Australia versus the world. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out with the channel. Now, I will still be covering Big Brother 27, so be on the lookout for that. And we'll be doing coverage of Survivor 49 once that gets started, so be on the lookout for that. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.